So while we have that pause, I'll go ahead and narrate the first couple of screens that are old news to the class from last week. Mere Christianity is what we're studying. C.S. Lewis. We studied chapter 1. Now we're got started with chapter 2, which is entitled "Some Objections," and we got to. I think we got past the introduction here. I was just narrating the few frames that we've already been through for the recording. In this particular chapter, Lewis is addressing objections to his concept of the moral law, the law of human nature. So again, he's coming at this from not necessarily a secular nature, but from a natural point of view. How can we derive God's laws from nature, so to speak? I guess that's the way I would interpret that. What exactly is the moral law? How does it differ from other explanations? We talked about the objection 1 is the moral law, just the herd instinct. We talked about the difference between feeling a desire and feeling an obligation. Oftentimes what really is required of us is not what we desire, but it's really the obligation. We might feel the need to flee away from danger, but the obligation there is to confront it. It's how what is it, the old saying about, the fireman or the policeman or the first responder, they're the ones that are going towards the danger, right, as opposed to fleeing away from it. So that's how you can tell the person that is responding to a moral edict. The drowning man example, we talked about that. Instinct of helping versus self-preservation. The third thing that judges between instincts cannot itself be an instinct. So you can't just, it's not it's not turtles all the way down. It's not just instinct. The piano analogy, the moral law is the sheet of music, not one of the keys. And the moral law often directs us to strengthen weaker instincts. And we talked about some scriptural references we thought were relevant. Is this where we got inherently good and bad instincts? No, I think we got past this maybe.
Yeah, I think we passed that one.
Yeah. So just briefly, no instinct is inherently good or bad. Of course, that should be self-evident. Sexual desire can be appropriate depending on the context. And we also talked about the fact that that is not relative morality. We're not talking about moral relativism. We're not saying that, we're not saying that you can say that a certain thing is good or bad depending on the relative situation, situational ethics. We're talking about it has to be for the right reasons. The sexual desire has to be for the right reason, in the right context. Having sex with someone that is not your spouse is never right, no matter what the situation is. So it's definitely not situational ethics. It's not, my husband doesn't love me. He never, is intimate with me, and so therefore I'm justified somehow. It's not that. The sexual instinct, the fighting instinct, even noble instincts like maternal love or patriotism sometimes need restraint. He says the moral law directs all instincts like notes on a piano. And then he gives us this practical warning, the danger of elevating any single impulse as an absolute guide. I think that we had gotten to this slide. I don't think we actually talked about that. Let's just make sure that... Forgot that I marked all these slides on paper, so I actually don't need the electronic device there. Let's see, this is objection 2, inherently good or bad. All right, so I think we'd kind of made our way down to the bottom, and I will just mention the last thing. By the way, the point is of great practical consequence. The most dangerous thing you can do is to take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might think love of humanity in general was safe, but it is not. If you leave out justice, you will find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence in trials for the sake of humanity, and become in the end a cruel and treacherous man. Again, we have to be kind of careful about that. I guess you could read into that relative morality, moral relativism. It's never right to cheat on your spouse, except if as Philip pointed out, I think last week, maybe that was the example that we used for that. The woman who had herself impregnated by the Nazi, Mrs. Bergmeyer, so that she could go see her family. So there was a greater good that was served by a somehow lesser sin, right? There's never one sin. There's never a goodness that's justified by a sin, right? Can we all agree on that? Is there ever an instance where, we're not talking about breaking eggs to make an omelet. That maybe is not the right way to say it. But is it ever the case that it's okay to do something wrong in order to have a right outcome?
In the long history of pro-life debates against pro-abortionists, the pro-abortionists often bring up very difficult and unusual cases of young 12-year-old girls, for example, who have been violated. And if they happen to get pregnant, are you saying she has to carry that baby to term as a pro-lifer? Are you demanding that she put her life at risk? She's just 12. While she could conceive, she's really not capable of carrying a baby. And then she has no economic ability to take care of that child. Just on and on they go, stacking up the difficulties with allowing that to happen.
Sure.
So I think that's the very point you were talking about. I think that's situation ethics, and I had not really thought about that. You just brought this up. That it's still very much in vogue today. They just don't use that term from Fletcher's book, but it's still the very same idea. That the end justifies the means, because it'd be so unthinkable if you let that baby come to term.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many other things you can stack up on the other side for the termination of that pregnancy and the effect it'll have on that same 12-year-old girl. So that can't justify.
And that was kind of what I was thinking as well. And I could just put it succinctly in that two wrongs don't make a right. Murdering an innocent doesn't undo the sin of that rape, right? So you can never balance the equation by doing two wrong things. You're just going to have a bigger weight on the wrong side of the equation. And it's not just that. It's not just the sin of that, but it's all the baggage that goes with it, all of the complications that perhaps.
That baby not bring extreme joy if she keeps it, if she could adopt it. But
and that's the thing too. How many times have we? And that's a very rare exception. That is a very rare exception, right? It is the case very often that a woman will terminate her pregnancy and she experiences great remorse later, and if not at that moment, but that is very frequent. That the moment after, what have I done? I can't undo it. I've done something that has permanent consequences. It's like suicide. It's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And as much as you might think that, there's some rationalization, carry that child to term. There are people that will adopt it. You may decide to keep it. How many times have you read the stories in the news of some woman who's a surrogate? And I don't like that idea at all either, because usually it's used for relationships that shouldn't exist anyway, homosexual relationships, and they'll pay a woman to, have a child for them. So how many times have you there's a court case you hear about that the surrogate has carried that child, and I want to keep this child. This child has been with me for 9 months, and I've developed an attachment with it. And you see that conflict. There's a maternal instinct that is part of human nature. I mean, that is hardwired in my belief to women, to nurture a child. I mean, that is, the Bible even talks about, the natural instincts of the woman. There are people who have, rejected that, the natural instincts that they should have. That takes effort, I believe, to reject those instincts. So making that choice in that moment to terminate a pregnancy, to have that abortion, is a permanent solution. 9 months, have the baby, give it up for adoption, have a lot fewer regrets. Maybe one day, man, I really should have kept that child and, go visit. But you can't do that unless it's at a grave, Anyway, I think a lot of times people really should seriously consider what they're doing before they do it. And, really people need to get educated and pray about it. Just there's a lot of really convenient actions that take place today. People do things because it's a spur of the moment. It's more about feelings in the spur of the moment instead of thinking about the ramifications long term. So anyway, I don't mean to get too far afield, but I do think that there is always a way out. God always gives you, he'll always provide a way out if you'll just take it. And so if you think that something bad has happened and there's a quick and easy solution that you might regret, I'm sure there's always another way. And sometimes things that we think are bad happen to us, and we don't realize that they were a good thing. And I'll just loosely use the 2 boats in a helicopter joke, the rising flood waters, and the guy goes to the roof, please, Lord, let me escape this water. And the boat comes by and he rejects the offer. No, I don't need a boat. And then the next boat comes by, the water's even higher. No. And then finally the helicopter, no, the Lord's going to save me. I've been praying about it. And then the guy dies. And then at the pearly gates, he says, Lord, why'd you abandon me? I sent 2 boats in a helicopter. The Lord provides us a way. We just don't see it sometimes. We either reject it because that can't be it, or we just don't see it because we're not paying attention. So I do think that, again, this idea that, doing something wrong is somehow going to be justified in the ends. The ends justify the means. 2 wrongs making a right. It is just not. It's not good enough. It doesn't hold water. No pun intended there. So this, but this point that he makes, this practical warning, there's got to be, I guess, a little bit of temperance involved, or if we're not doing something wrong, we have to balance all these things out. And he again gives this example of having this overarching thing of thinking love of humanity is safe, but if you leave out justice. And you might think that, okay, so let's give another example. Let's think of another example using what he has given us. Love of humanity. We love humanity, therefore, we cannot have justice for someone. There's some murderer out there who is, incorrigible, refuses to not murder. What else are you going to do with them? There has to be some justice. We can't just unquestionably love humanity so much that we will allow, murderers and rapists and.
Well, that's the current debate about the open border.
Exactly.
The love of humanity is an argument they like to put forward, but there is such a thing as justice because there are laws, and especially when you're having an invasion of people who are on terrorist lists.
Yeah. That's exactly the point, I think, that we can draw from this, and that's a great example that we can use to understand his point. So again, we're not talking about, relative morality. We're talking about you can't have one thing that overrides all other things. We have to look at all of these moral principles and put them together to come up with the right answer. It's not just one thing. But again, we're not talking about justifying a sin. We're talking about trying to live a moral life, a complete moral life. Now, here are the scriptural references. Maybe we went over, maybe we didn't. So these are ones that AI suggested for us to consider with respect to this particular section. Ecclesiastes 3, 1 through 8, for everything there's a season and a time for every matter under heaven. The context being different impulses are appropriate at different times. I can see that. Some things are wrong in certain contexts, some things are wrong in others. 1 Corinthians 7, 3 through 5, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights. Likewise, the wife to her husband on the appropriate expression of sexual desire in marriage. Would it be wrong to withhold, that? Those are the kind of questions that we need to think about sometimes. Romans 13:4, for he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain on the appropriate use of force by governing authorities. And I suppose we would think of that in terms of what we just said of the, people. There is a law to be obeyed. There is a civil law. And if you break that civil law, then you need to be prepared to be punished for it. If you're here illegally, then you should be prepared to pay the consequence. And it doesn't matter, what a nice person you are. The guy that just robbed a bank, it doesn't matter, the 99 good things that he did that day. You robbed a bank, you're going to have to pay the consequences. So, Philippians 2, 3 through 4, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interest, but also to the interest of others. That is on the proper direction of self-interest. And again, you think about, I can't help but think of that. I've never seen, what's the name of that? Is it Wall Street? That's the movie with Michael Douglas. That greed is good quote. You know what I'm talking about? That was kind of the famous quote from that movie. They used to play it all the time. Greed is good. So is greed good? Maybe we wouldn't say that, but we would say that, proper direction of self-interest can be good. It's in our best interest to go to heaven. Therefore, we should treat people in the way that they want to be treated, So there is a place for self-interest and that does not rise to the level of, greed or selfishness. And of course, that's in the terms of the saving the guy from drowning. There's a self-interest, not being able to live with yourself if you see someone in need and you don't help them. So I think that would be appropriate as well. Look not only to your own interest, but to the interest of others. And in Matthew 10:37, whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. So even family love must be properly ordered. That's a good point. You can't just, well, I love Mama so much and she was a Methodist and I'm just going to be a Methodist because I can't stand the idea of not being in heaven with her, even though you're not going to be, kind of. You know what I'm saying? So there is kind of a limit to even familial love, as Jesus himself says. Anyway, I think those are some pretty good references. All right, so objection 3, he says, and these are, again, the kind of headlines, and you can read those while I read the text. So from the book, he says, other people wrote to me saying, isn't what you call the moral law just a social convention, something that is put into us by education? They certainly don't teach that now. Anyway.
They taught that in Cuba years ago. I was having a conversation with
Yeah.
and mentioned the moral argument for the existence of God. Of course, he was brought up under Marxism, under communism.
Mm-hmm.
He was very agnostic. And he said, well, morality, the moral law is just a social convention. That was his idea. That's what they teach in the schools there.
So it was brainwashing, basically, is what he's saying, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he's saying that what the moral law is a form of brainwashing
And I
because
think
it.
I may have asked him simply, well, suppose you grew up in society like South Africa, you know, apartheid, when it used to be the norm. Would that make it right that the whites there mistreated, allegedly mistreated the blacks? Would that make it right just because that was the social convention of the time? That's what everybody was doing. Actually, they weren't the majority, but the ones with power did do it.
Sure.
Well, I don't know. I mean, he thought about it, but I was kind of struck by the fact that they did discuss those things in their schools there, and they
Mm-hmm.
had an answer, Fidel's answer.
Yeah, or slavery would be another one.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a social convention, right? That was a social norm. There are a lot of things that are that in various societies. It was a social norm to hate Jewish people and to lock them up in forced labor camps. That just was, hey, yeah, sure, sounds like a good idea. Everybody went along with it. So it's this idea that it's like eating feces. My dad used to use that analogy. He said, 5 billion flies can't be wrong. It must be a good thing to do, right? Um, anyway, I'm sorry, that's kind of graphic. I think somebody put it a little more, although this is not politically correct either, eat rice, 5 billion Chinese can't be wrong, that kind of idea. Doesn't make it, rice isn't bad. Anyway, I'll stop with the analogies. So, back to the reading. Something that's put into us by education. I think there's a misunderstanding here. The people who ask that question are usually taking it for granted that if we've learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be merely a human invention. So if we've learned a thing from parents and teachers, then that thing must be a human invention. But of course, that's not so. We all learn the multiplication table at school. A child who does not grow up, a child who grew up alone on a desert island would not know the multiplication table, right? But surely it does not follow that the multiplication table is simply a human convention, something that human beings have made up for themselves and might have made different if they had liked. I fully agree that we learn the rule of decent behavior from parents and teachers and friends and books as we learn everything else. But some of the things we learn are mere conventions which might have been different. We learn to keep to the left of the road, but it might just as well have been to rule to keep to the right of the road. And others of them, like mathematics, are real truths. The question is to which class does the law of human nature belong? So you see his point there. It's kind of different. This is 70-year-old English from a Englishman, and I barely can understand them anyway sometimes. But the point being that there are some things that they're not just made up human things, like 5 times 5 is 25. Conceptually, now the number 5 is a symbol, but it represents a real thing, or it represents a thing that is universally understood, 5 of something. Whether you count, uno, dos, tres, cuatro, cinco, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or un, deux, trois, quatre, cinq. That's about all I know. So you might have different words for it. It might be Roman numerals, an I for a 1. But conceptually, there is, one of this thing that I'm holding up. There's uno. That is just a fact of nature. So, and then there are other things like, do we drive on the right side of the road, left side of the road? That's just kind of arbitrary. We just made that up.
That reminds me, years ago we had a debate with the professor at West Georgia, Dr. Daniel Hominiak, about homosexual behavior. He was an ex-priest, or he was a psychology teacher too, who taught that. Y'all, I guess most of us remember that, where he was promoting homosexual behavior. And in his lectures, I used to go hear, he made that very point. When Paul condemned homosexual behavior in Romans 1, these were cultural taboos, and that's all it's appealing to. It's not a moral norm that we violate, it's merely a social convention. And he used the expression, he said, just like the Brits drive on the left side of the road and we drive on the right. There's nothing inherently right or wrong one or the other. It's just if you went into Britain and drove on the right side of the road, you could cause a lot the same thing was true of the Convention Against Homosexuality.
Sure. There are whole societies where everybody's homosexual, right? I mean, it just does a flip of the coin.
West Hollywood, I think.
Well, they won't last long. Yeah, it won't be sustained one generation. But yeah. Anyway, that's just silly. No, there are some just ground truth laws, some things that are true and not true. And the question is, he says, to which class does the law of human nature belong? He says there are two reasons for saying it belongs to the same class as mathematics. So we're talking about the natural law, right? There are two reasons for saying it belongs to that same class. The first is, as I said in the first chapter, that though there are differences between the moral ideas of one time or country and those of another, the differences are not really very great, not nearly so great as most people imagine. So we talked about the idea of, murdering or stealing somebody's property. Those are universal across various countries and time periods. And you can recognize the same law running through them all, whereas mere conventions like the rule of the road or the kind of clothes people wear may differ to any extent. The other reason is this: when you think about these differences between the morality of one people and another, do you think that the morality of one people is ever better or worse than that of another? Have any of the changes been improvements? If not, then of course there could never be any moral progress. Progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer and better than any other, then there'd be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality, or Christian morality to Nazi morality. So you understand what he's saying there. In fact, of course, we do all believe that some moralities are better than others, right? Not all cultures are the same. We can't possibly be if we differ in our moral codes. There's got to be one that's superior as opposed to another. And there may be that, there's none that are perfect, right? There may be some that just, there may not be a perfect. However, you definitely can have, various degrees of betterness. We do believe that some of the people who tried to change the moral ideas of their own age were what we would call reformers or pioneers, people who understood morality better than their neighbors did. Very well then, the moment that you say that one set of moral ideas can be better than another, you are in fact measuring them both by a standard. Now this is where we really get into the meat of the argument, right? How can you say there's better and there's worse unless there's a yardstick to measure them by? See, now we're getting into the more intellectual side of the argument. But the standard that measures two things is something different from either, right? So we're not just saying that relative to, the United States culture, African culture is worse or Canadian culture is better. We're not, it's not a relative measuring. There is an external standard. There's a standard that is separate from those two. You're, in fact, comparing them both with some real morality, admitting that there is such a thing as a real right, independent of what people think, and that some people's ideas get nearer to that real right than others. Or put it this way, if your moral ideas can be truer and those of the Nazis less true, there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. Of course, we remember the context. This is in World War II that he's giving these talks. So the Nazis, it's not today where, Elon Musk is a Nazi kind of a argument. This is actual Nazis. So there must be something, some real morality for them to be true about. The reason why your idea of New York can be true or less true than my idea of New York is that New York is a real place, existing quite apart from what either of us thinks, right? If when each of us said New York each means merely the town I am imagining in my own head, how could one of us have truer ideas than the other? There would be no question of truth or falsehood at all. In the same way, if the rule of decent behavior meant simply whatever each nation happens to approve, there would be no sense in saying that any one nation had ever been more correct in its approval than any other. No sense in saying that the world could ever grow morally better or morally worse. You kind of wonder if the prosecutors at the Nuremberg trials that would have occurred after this, you kind of wonder, were they listening to this? Were they aware of these arguments? And you kind of wonder if this idea kind of pervaded.
What year were the radio talks?
Well, I mean, it was during the war, so
During the war?
I believe so, because he was, I don't think it was, I mean, I could be wrong, but that was my understanding. If I'm wrong, please forgive me.
We know he was involved in it as a leader of.
Okay, so the contents first given on the air and then published in 3 separate parts as broadcast talks. That would be 1942, 1943, 1944. So that was just the published version. So the talks themselves would have even been prior to that, maybe in 42. I don't remember. So that's what I'm saying. I mean, these ideas seem to ring, with the same tone that the ideas that those prosecutors.
This is fascinating, wonderful material, because his genius was to be able to put it into plain language for everybody, like it make sense in a radio talk on the BBC.
Mm-hmm.
But philosophers have been discussing this sort of thing for years. This is not new.
Oh, sure.
All the way back to Kant, especially. He talked about the summum bonum, the highest good and stuff. He's just taken all that sort of stuff and brought it down to our level, made it all that he's obviously well aware of the many debates in academic philosophy, but he's just made it so plain. That's the beauty of his work.
Yeah, and that's the great thing about these ideas, is that they continue to pervade and they continue to circulate, right? And they continue to get restated, perhaps in a different language, in a different form, because these ideas, I think, are correct. I think that there is, and we know that they're correct in that we know that the Bible is that standard. It is that yardstick. God has given us this thing by which we can measure our own morality. Now, we would say that. He's not making that argument yet. He's just saying that there exists. Sure. And he's saying that there exists this yard. Well, what is that yardstick? That's kind of the spoiler. That's kind of the, tune in next time. So, not yet though. It's still got 20 minutes. So let's go. Okay, so let's talk about the scripture reference before we go on to this next section. So here's the scripture references. Romans 1:19 through 20. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to him. I think this is I think we've seen this before, this reference, perhaps. In a previous slide, for his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world. So, again, in this context, we look at nature and we can see that, right? We can see God through the things that he has created. I think that's what that is.
That'd be more to support the idea of natural theology, where we can establish God from nature. But the other one, the other one Machine put up before was Romans 2, where it talked about how the Gentiles come out of the law.
You're right. You're right.
That's right to the point.
Yeah. So I think we can understand that, and that's kind of where he's going with this. We see the argument, and we know where he's going. I mean, we clearly know the end of this. We know the whodunit. Psalm 19:1 through 4. The heavens declare the glory of God. There's no speech, nor are there words. Whose voice is not heard. Their voice goes throughout all the earth. So, again, back to the nature displaying God's existence through his handiwork, through its very existence. Amos 1 and 2, God judges nations by moral standards they should have known despite not having the Mosaic law. I guess we could go back and read that. Acts 17:26 through 28. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth that they should seek God. And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth that they should seek God. So what do you suppose the link there is? I would imagine it is the fact that we can find God in a sense through nature. We should at least understand that there is a creator from the very fact of our existence, and that we should seek God. We should seek who that creator is, right? Shouldn't that be kind of built in? If you didn't know anything about God, if you just woke up and you had no memory on a desert island, you kind of, well, how did I get here? There had to be some, what's my purpose here? Why, what is it that old, was the Admiral, what's the guy that ran with Perot? Who am I? Why am I here? I can't remember his name. Anyway. So there should be this inclination to want to seek our creator. It should just be innate. It should be built in. Hebrews 8:10, I'll put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. Again, that idea.
I think that more has to do with the law of the New Testament. It's put into their minds and written on their hearts. But first it goes into their minds through the medium of the written or spoken word.
Yeah, that is true. That is ultimately, how can you put laws into their minds lest they, read it or come to an understanding of it? Can you come to an understanding naturally, I guess, would be the question.
They have to internalize it. Unlike under the first covenant, you could be not even know the law that well, and many didn't, and they certainly didn't make it part of their lives. Is the ideal under the new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't think this means that. I don't think the Hebrew writer is saying God gives us a moral instinct or something like that.
Well, the danger there is if I take that in that way, if I say, well, God wrote it on my heart, that opens up a can of worms, right? Because, well, what does my heart say? That's exactly what people would say today, and perhaps that's a misunderstanding. And again, I put these things up sometimes because, not only does AI get it wrong, but why does it get it wrong? Because of the interpretation was wrong to begin with. And so, perhaps this is a result of the fact.
It just gathers all this stuff that's already been published on this in the past.
Basically, yeah. Basically, all of the width and breadth of human knowledge that is fed into it, it takes that and it basically, tabulates it, databases it, slices it, dices it, and then you ask it, and it goes and it. But basically, what an LLM does, large language model, is it starts saying something, and then it predicts what word comes next. It's kind of the way it is. When you're typing a letter now in the word processor, and it kind of predicts predictive text, it's that on steroids, which is why it's cool, because you're asking a question and it responds and it starts the response, and then it's like, well, what word should come next? What word should come? And then as it's going, it continues to build out that thought. It's amazing how it works. So, but this is really derivative of human thought, because that's how AIs learn things, is by taking, and that's kind of a big controversy these days. How does AI know anything unless we feed it books that perhaps are copyrighted? Perhaps, you see what I'm saying? And so it's human knowledge, basically. So human interpretation have informed the AI on that particular verse. And I would say that's a pretty common interpretation of that verse, especially if you're looking for a reason, for a justification, right? The Lord laid it on my heart, kind of a justification, right? But we know better than that. We know that the only way to know, objective truth is through the Bible. There is no other way. There's no other fair way to do it. You can't just intuit it, because that leads you down dangerous paths, right? You cannot, there's no way to look at nature and take from nature and derive the Bible, right? You can't, there's no way to distill nature and natural laws and things and come up with the Bible. The Bible was a revelation. It is a miraculous document right? It is God's word, God's will being given to men. And there's no way that you could have, distilled that. You can't come up with an equation that generates the Bible, right? Is the way I'm trying to, hopefully I'm expressing that properly.
I don't mean to get off the egg plan. I just wondered, could you quickly look up or Google the 7 Noahide laws?
Sure.
Among the Jews, especially in medieval times, they had codified what they thought were the laws that Gentiles recognized. The law that Paul was talking about, the law that they follow, even though they don't have the law of Moses.
Sure. So the 7 Noahide laws, a core concept in Jewish tradition, are seen as universal moral principles given to mankind after the flood and include prohibitions against idolatry, blasphemy, murder, sexual immorality, theft, and eating flesh from a living animal, along with the requirement to establish courts of justice. So
that 6th one is kind of odd, but
not to consume meat that is torn from a living animal, I guess. So, you don't just, it's not like the old.
After the Jerusalem conference in Acts 15, the letter that was sent out by the apostles telling the Gentiles not to be troubled by the Judaizers, you don't have to keep the law of Moses, just abstain from idols and abstain from fornication and abstain from blood. People wonder, well, that was part of the law of Moses, but evidently they consider that to be a universal prohibition, not just confined to the law of Moses, not just a ceremonial precept under the law, but even antedating that all the way back to the time of Noah. That was their idea. And it looks like there might be something to it according to the Acts 15 record. Think about that.
Yeah.
They said, this is what we're to teach them. Abstain from fornication and blood. Abstain from blood.
Yeah. I'm sorry to do this, but the flesh ripped from a live animal reminds me of the three-legged pig joke. You know what I'm talking about? The three-legged pig joke. I found a short version of it. So a guy goes and asks the farmer, what's with the three-legged pig? The farmer says, oh, that's my lucky pig, that is. What do you mean? The farmer says, well, one day I was out on the tractor plowing the fields and the barn caught fire. That pig ran over the field to find me and oinked continuously until I followed him back to the farm. Thanks to him, I saved the barn. Wow, sounds like a lucky pig. Yep. Another time, my tractor tipped over and I was stuck under it. He grabbed hold of my belt, dragged me out. I reckon he saved my life. Amazing, what a pig. He's won the best-looking pig twice in a row, too. He's a good-looking specimen, but why does he only got 3 legs? Well, you don't eat a pig like that all at once, do you? Anyway, y'all know that one. That's older than I am. All right, so to the last section here. The important distinction, moral differences versus factual differences. Moral differences versus factual differences. So again, we talked about the yardstick, the concept of this moral yardstick. I conclude then that though the difference between people's ideas of decent behavior often make you suspect that there is no real natural law of behavior at all, yet the things we are bound to think about these differences really prove just the opposite. I conclude then that, I'm going to read that again. I conclude then that though the difference between people's ideas of decent behavior often make you suspect there's no real natural law of behavior at all, yet the things we are bound to think about these differences really prove just the opposite. But one word before I end, I have met people who exaggerate the differences because they have not distinguished between differences of morality and differences of belief about facts. For example, one man said to me, 300 years ago, people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct? Kind of goes back to the arguments we were talking about earlier, the Nazis, right? But surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe that there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, then these filthy quislings did. There's no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply about matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches, There is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mousetraps if he did so because he believed that there were no mice in the house. Does that make sense? That's perhaps a bit different. All his stuff is just so arcane, some of the ideas, but
I wouldn't call him inhumane if he did set traps.
yeah, set them anyway. So you would not call a man humane because he didn't set out mousetraps if he did so because he thought there were no mice in the house. So the witch trial example, he says, not a different morality, but a different set of factual beliefs. So, I guess that's the problem is that, well, that was the problem back then for people that weren't really witches, is it wrong to kill a witch? Well, the Bible says that, thou shalt not suffer a witch to live. So, pretty clear cut. Do we believe that there are witches? Well, that begs the question. Of course, we're living under the New Testament now, and there are plenty of women and men who say they're witches, and not just the Harry Potter cutesy role-playing kind of a thing, but, there are legitimately people that do pretty nasty things, think they're putting hexes on people. Should there be some kind of a consequence or penalty for that? Well, we don't need to get off in that. It's probably we need to wrap it up. Moral principles can be applied to incorrect factual assumptions. So you can do the right thing for the wrong reason, I guess, or the wrong thing for the right reason. I guess depends on how you look at it. And then here, of course, 1 Corinthians 8, 4 through 13, Paul's discussion of food sacrificed to idols. Same moral principle of love applied to different factual beliefs about idols, right? If someone thinks that, if you're eating food that's been sacrificed to an idol and it causes them to stumble, then that's a problem. You shouldn't be doing that. Stop doing things that are offensive to your brother. Of course, that's notwithstanding the brother should know better and should get better educated. But still, it's about the idea of not doing something that you don't have to do that is causing a problem for your brother or your sister. Acts 10, 9 through 16, Peter's vision challenging his factual beliefs about clean and unclean foods. Remember, kill and eat. Don't call anything unclean, right? So again, there was a change there. There was a change in attitude because that's when he was called to go see Cornelius and to introduce Gentiles into the faith officially.
In this particular case, the facts were on his side at one time, but the facts changed.
Yeah, the facts changed, and so again, it's an imperfect, perhaps, example, but you can see that the facts did change, and so the morality then changed because the facts changed. But that's pretty rare, that you would get a different set of, and that only really happened between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Let's see, John 9, 1 through 3, Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." Jesus was correcting the factual assumptions about the cause of the man's blindness, right? So they thought, oh, this man, is it because of this? Is it because of that? No, this is the reason. It was to display, unless I'm misunderstanding its point here, so that the works of God might be displayed in him. So it wasn't because of what they thought was the truth of his, he's blind because of his sin or someone else's sin.
It looks like 1 Corinthians 8 and Romans 14 are the two most appropriate, doesn't it? Because the principle is if you are worshiping an idol, that is a sin under any covenant.
Mm-hmm.
But factually, Paul's showing that, nothing changes that meat. Just because the day before, for example, it was offered to an idol, now it's being sold down in the marketplace,
yeah,
and you purchase a piece of that. If you purchase it because you think it was somehow tainted by the pollution of the idol, don't eat it because you'd be hurting your conscience. Even though factually you'd be incorrect, but you'd be violating your conscience even though it's based on misinformation.
Yeah.
And you would be willingly violating your conscience. In other words, I don't care if it's idol worship, I'll do it.
Yeah.
So that's the point he's making there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and And two, Paul clearly says that if you think something is wrong and you do it anyway, even if it's not wrong technically, then it would be wrong because you think it's wrong and you're violating your conscience. Exactly your point. One person esteems one day as better than another, while one esteems all days alike. Each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. So differing factual beliefs. And again, we're saying factual belief. It's not a factual belief. It is a belief that someone thinks is factual, right? So there's a bit of a distinction there because, if I'm convinced and I think something is a fact, I could be wrong, right? I could be incorrect in what I think is right. For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. God judges based on true moral reality, not appearances. So I guess that's you can kind of see that. So again, incorrect. We say, okay, we see a person and they look like, oh, that looks like a good person. Well, why do we think that? I mean, really, it's the actions. It's the heart of the person. So either you observe the actions of that person, which would be something you could visibly see, or God can see inside of a person, the actual person themselves on the inside, so to speak. So again, looks can be deceiving, and the facts as we perceive them could be incorrect, but that doesn't mean that the morality has changed. It's just our understanding of what the facts are. So we can think something's okay and do it, but it's really wrong. That's like Paul again. Let's go back to Paul, where he was out there persecuting Christians, right? I did it in all good conscience. I thought that this was the thing I should be doing. And it probably would have been correct if it had been some wild cult, some sect that was anti, Judaism, that was perverting, if it was some, sacrilegious cult. It would have been perfectly, acceptable and right to be doing what he was doing. But he was not doing it because the facts had changed, that now God expects all men everywhere to repent, right? Now is different, not in the way that what's was it the Methodist hymnal or Baptist, but now it's different. What was that quote? Baptist manual. Hiscox, yeah. And what was the idea there? What was
in the days of the apostles, baptism was a doorway into the church. He said in that sense, baptism was necessary, but now it is different.
Yeah, so Hiscox manual it said, well, back in the disciples' days, baptism was necessary, but today it's different for some reason. Reasons.
In their newer version of their statement of faith, I think they left that out.
I think they'd be well served to leave that out from that. So anyway, it came up with some discussion questions that I threw up there. We don't have to go over them, but we can read them. How do we distinguish between when to follow our instincts and when to override them? From the very beginning of this chapter. In what ways do you experience the moral law as something outside yourself? How does Lewis's concept of objective morality compare with relativistic views? So again, that's something we talked about pretty extensively. What are the practical implications of Lewis's argument for how we live our lives? That's a good question. This is something that I would expect that if you were having a Bible study with somebody and you were inching them along, that what is the implication? If there is a yardstick, what are the implications, right? Maybe I need to find this yardstick. Maybe I need to know what that looks like. How does this foundation of natural law prepare us for Lewis's later theological arguments? Well, I think we've talked about that too, that he's going to bring up the fact that, well, where does that come? What is that yardstick? Where does it come from? Who supplied it? It has to be an exterior force. It has to be an exterior entity. All right, let me